you. Thank you, Doreen, and thanks to the AIC for inviting me to your Forum on Color 2022. My talk is Requiem for a Drowning Landscape. My work involves research, scientific collaboration, examination, documentation, analysis, and synthesis using art, science, and technology for environmental advocacy. I trained in art and landscape architecture. The observation of nature and culture has been central focus of my work over the years. Some of my color works include Requiem for a Drowning Landscape, Spartina Winter Ice, and the Landscape Mosaics series, including leaves and grass and coastal color palettes installations. This elegy, the elegy for coasts and estuaries in a changing world, the Atlantic salt marsh. This elegy for coasts and estuaries in a changing world must be told. There's an urgency to the storytelling. By 2100, at current rates of warming, the seas are projected to rise 24 inches along most of the US coasts. The increase in air temperatures caused by the rise in CO2 concentrations and other greenhouse gases will increase the snow and ice melt. If the polar ice caps were to disappear, the sea level is estimated to rise 60 to 70 meters higher than at present. Mountain glaciers make up 1% of the volume of land ice. Their potential contribution to sea level rise is about 1 meter, should their meltwater flow to the sea. The rising seas will impact the salt marsh, which rings the shore and transitions and arbitrates between the land and the sea. The salt marsh of an estuary is one of the most productive zones on Earth. The mixing of the tidal and fresh waters and the input of nutrients feeds a host of species which depend on it for food and cover. The salt marsh is tough yet fragile. It withstands extremes of temperature, freezing, thawing, saturation, and drought. The plants of the salt marsh are uniquely adapted to life on the edge of the sea. The Atlantic salt marsh zonation with creeks. Salt marshes can be differentiated into distinct zones, which correspond to the increasing elevation and decreasing durations of submergence. The lowest zone is vegetated by a variety of drifting and detached algae and eelgrass, Zostera marina. Above, a tall form of Spartina alterniflora may be found growing along the edges of channels and creeks, creek banks, and ditches. The low marsh zone. Spartina alterniflora dominates the low marsh, where it forms dense, continuous stands. The intertidal zone. The next highest zone is the intertidal area from mean low tide to mean high tide. This is the low marsh or Spartina alterniflora zone. If you notice in the illustration on the left, this is the short form of Spartina alterniflora. The high marsh zone. The high marsh zone is the uppermost zone of the salt marsh and is usually only centimeters higher than the low marsh. However, this elevation difference is enough to restrict the tidal intrusion to spring flood tides and storm tides. The lower edge of this zone may include the short form of Spartina alterniflora mixed with Spartina patens. Spartina patens, or salt hay, dominate the high marsh, where it mixes with other grasses, including Dipsaus chilis spicata, which is pike grass. Juncus geraldi, black rush, often indicates a freshwater intrusion into the salt marsh and marks the next increase in elevation, with high marsh forbs to the Iva frutescens zone. Here's photographs of the salt marsh to the terrestrial edge in autumn. The difference goes from salt water to fresh. And I will remark that those colors are real. When I was photographing those, I was using Kodachrome film, which is as close as I think as I could get. Above in New England is generally a forested terrestrial edge that demarcates the saltwater zones from freshwater zone. Each zone's plant palette represents an adaptation to the degree of salinity, submersion, and elevation. The rising seas will impact the salt marsh, which ring the shore, transitions and arbitrates between land and sea. Dieback, tropic cascade. That narrow ribbon of marsh between land and sea is dying. What is killing the salt marsh is not fully known. The stress of climate change, sea level rise, warming trends, drought, salinity change with coastal development, pollution, and a constricted growing area may develop stress-related pathogens and opportunistic predation, which infect, attack, and kill the salt marsh grass. The Spartina marsh is stripped bare, leaving the hollowed out memory of the marsh grass roots, which erode with each high tide as the rising tides move steadily inland, inundating the high marsh. Spartina petens and Ditchlicus spicata of the high marsh cannot adapt or migrate quickly enough to counter the effects of sea level rise, and so the high marsh of the Atlantic coast is slowly drowning. Climate change also affects species composition. There's scientific documentation that the southern Sasama crab is established a beachhead at Wellfleet Bay, Massachusetts, where the crab is eating the low marsh Spartina alterniflora to bear mud, slowly stunting and killing the marsh grasses. The tropic cascade of predator and prey is out of balance. Salt marsh dieback has many causes such as sea level rise, climate change, drought, stress pathogens, invasive species, and tropic imbalance. This is not a local problem. Scientists report salt marsh dieback from Maine to Louisiana. The end result is a loss of coastal protection, habitat, biodiversity, estuary and landscape resilience, and sustainable fishery. Here you can see actual mapping and plan views that are showing how build-out has altered Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And the build-up for 2025 is actually current, I would say. And if you look to the middle lower area, you can see the outlines of the Spartina dieback locations marked in red or black. That's a small selection of them. There are others. And on the your right, you can see what a healthy salt marsh looks like. So with its meanders of the Spartina patens mixed with the Spartina alterniflora on the edges of the creeks. And the middle image shows you what happens with salt marsh dieback. You can see how the salt marsh is being consumed within the high marsh, and below, consumed to bare mud. And my thanks in this case to the Woods Hole Research Center and to Stephen M. Smith of the National Park Service, Cape Cod National Seashore. So why and what can we do? Well, as an artist, I work on art in the environmental piece and environmental pieces called Spartina Winter Ice. Spartina Winter Ice is the first in a series of environmental advocacy works I created, focused on the vulnerability of the US Atlantic coastline to sea level rise. The installation documents the melting of winter ice from the Spartina patens marsh and the rising tide washing over the salt marsh on the last day of winter. Let me just find this. Spartina Winter Ice is an animation of gridded projections which capture images from the sunrise on the marsh and sea level rise from first light to high noon. I was actually out there at dawn with a tripod and a terrific camera, and was able to document the change of the melting of ice, which I used in within the Spartina Winter Ice piece. The work is projected onto a corresponding grid of handmade salt marsh fiber sheets fixed to a scrim of sheer linen. The wall behind the scrim is set with a corresponding grid of coarse salt marsh fiber panels, flanked by salt marsh grasses gathered from the site. The projections are sequenced to project from top panels down and is synchronized with the recorded sound of waves washing over the shore. Spartina Winter Ice presents a microcosm of global concerns as rising temperature, polar ice cap melting, the global sea level rise accelerate with each passing year. And as the piece progressed, the panels would fall. They were timed to fall into the scrim below, echoing this shedding of ice from the polar caps and glaciers. Art in the environment, landscape mosaics. For all its utility, few see the beauty of the salt marsh, remember it, soon it will be gone. For many years, I visited the marsh and relished in its seasonal change of color and pattern. My work, Landscape Mosaics, has charted that change over time. Through methodically charted color palettes, the work traces the growth of the marsh through the seasons using color change. The change is based on a number of scientific principles in plant physiology, including the quality, intensity, and duration of light, allowing for photosynthesis. I installed hundreds of color panels, which I call pixel panels, representing the color projection of the marsh below. The colors were charted using Pantone colors held directly to the plants at fixed times of day to reflect the altering of color with a degree of light and the span of time. The Pantone colors were then matched to custom mixed acrylic paints applied to primed panels set into the salt marsh on thin neutral colored stakes. The color panels appeared to float above the sea of grass. I added additional color panels as the seasons progressed until the landscape was pixelated with hundreds of color squares representing the mosaic of the salt marsh landscape through the seasons. Originally, I painted color swatches of the colors of Spartina. However, I found this to be too variable for color accuracy, so I decided to match the colors of the salt marsh using Pantone colors. And I'll also mention that as part of the studies, I was doing aerial overflights of the salt marsh through the seasons. And so I was able to capture, for example, this image of the Neponset salt marsh. Now, in those days, which is the 1990s, I would actually dive into the color pixels of each of the photograph, and almost in a microscopic way, I would color blend from pixel to pixel to develop a wash of colors. And these I printed out with pigments. There were actually pigments and not inks that I used when I did other pieces beyond this, such as leaves and grass. So on the left-hand side, you can see the unretouched on the top image of a Kodachrome image of the salt marsh as it's going through the late summer seeding into autumn. Below is the wash of gold. And in the central area, you can see the gradation of color from early spring through the summer seeding into the orange tones, into the violet tones, and then into autumn and senescence. Leaves and Grass is an ephemeral installation of handmade color Spartina grass paper palettes embedded in an autumnal Spartina patens high marsh. With the lunar high tides, the paper palettes floated free and returned to the sea, hovering in the moonlight waters before dissolving. The temporal progression of color change from spring through fall can be quite striking as light intensity increases and temperatures warm with the coming of spring. Perennial marsh plants are released from dormancy and begin to sprout new shoots. The new growth is fueled primarily by burning reserve stocks of carbohydrates that were stored in the roots and rhizomes all winter. Generally, it's a vegetation bordering creek banks that greens up first, as these plants are typically the most vigorous within the marsh. They benefit from enhanced drainage and therefore resulting in higher levels of oxygen within the root zones. So take a look at the leaves and grass, if you would, and looking closer, you can see the pigments that were color blended for each piece, for each sheet that were printed out. And then here's a collection, not all of them, but some of them, of some of the color blendings that I created for the marsh installations. On the upper left is the book cover for a folio that I'd created, and here's a color palette using the Pantone colors. A myriad of physiological and biochemical processes underlie plant coloration and color changes in the salt marsh. During the summer, individual species of marsh grasses and forbs take on their own unique signature of green. Will all possess chlorophyll for photosynthesis, there is considerable variation in the relative proportions of different types of chlorophyll molecules, which contributes to subtle differences in the overall color. Other photosynthetic and accessory pigments that help plants harvest different wavelengths of sunlight and protect underlying tissue from ultraviolet radiation damage also contribute to color variety. These include yellow and orange carotenoids and xanthophylls. The thickness and composition of the waxy cuticle on the outside surface of the leaves also affects the way that light is absorbed and reflected from plants. They also receive higher nutrient loads from the deposition of marine sediments carried in on the tides. Interior portions are the slowest to color up, as these plants are typically stressed from much poorer drainage, lower oxygen concentrations in the soil, and higher concentrations of hydrogen sulfide. Regardless, emergence from the ground and exposure to sunlight then stimulates the plants to produce more chlorophyll as photosynthesis begins to contribute more and more to growth. The physiological transition manifests itself as a change from light to dark green as the season progresses. As plants begin to senesce during the late summer through fall, reductions in the synthesis of chlorophyll allow underlying pigments to show through. And this is what you're seeing here. Spartina marsh color palette. During the autumn, the salt marsh transforms into shimmering shades of gold, olive, violet, and taupe. Various byproducts of chlorophyll degradation also result in unusual color patterns, and some chemicals like anthocyanin, red, purple, and blue, are actively synthesized during the process of senescence. During this time, water, nutrients, and carbohydrates are being drawn away from the leaves and translocated down to the rhizomes as part of the metabolic function, eventually resulting in leaf senescence, which transforms the marsh landscape into its characteristic golden brown color of autumn and early winter. Take a look at this aerial oblique plan that I created. Now, a number of these components have been shown individually, but never as a composite, never as a whole. That's something I hope will happen in the future. So entering in, you go through past the winter and into spring. And with the spring comes the anadromous fish returning to spawn. Summer brings the summer seeding. Autumn brings a change of coloration to senescence of winter. Requiem for drowning landscape, like box panels, remembrance, spring. The projected Spartina Winter Ice is followed with a series of lightbox panels tracing the seasonal progression of the salt marsh within a darkened gallery. Each panel is set with iconic photographs of color transformation in the salt marsh, representing a seasonal change. Each panel is set with its corresponding color palette, representing a seasonal time expressed in colored light. Imagery and text explain and illustrate the process from dormancy, emergence, growth, reproduction, senescence to death. Projections, retelling, summer seeding. Seeding occurs in late summer into autumn, and with it, the marsh transforms into a kaleidoscope of colors. This is represented as an animation set to a musical score. Lightbox panels, remembrance, autumn. Here are a series of lightbox panels tracing the autumnal seasonal progression of the salt marsh within the darkened gallery. Anadromous Awakening. Here, illuminated anadromous fish are suspended from the ceiling to cast shadows and reflections on the gallery floor and ceiling. The next room is Recollection. It's a series of light panels and illuminated glass rods set in a meandering pattern. Recollection interprets the seasonal progression of the salt marsh using projected colored light in a color meander representing the staggered intervals of seasonal growth and decline in an experiential way. The installation traces out the color change from the slow breaking of dormancy in spring, the lengthening of daylight hours, to a rapid state of pure, luminous green chlorophyll. By summer, The maturation of growth deepens the color. Seeding occurs in late summer into autumn, and with it, the marsh transforms into a kaleidoscope of colors. The colors become muted with the shortening of daylight and the cooler night temperatures as the plants become dormant with the onset of winter. Requiem for Drowning Landscape, Salt Marsh Memoria Installation. These color projections were installed along a creek meander of the tidal North River in Situate, Massachusetts, as part of a cyber arts festival in Boston. 1,500 vertical posts were primed and painted with custom mix acrylic paints, which matched the Pantone colors, I might add, with the help of students, and installed into the high marsh after the community environmental reviews and permitting. The colored posts mark the seasonal progression of color and time in the salt marsh and were reflected in the waters of the rising spring lunar tides, which inundated the high marsh. There's a science to the transformation and adaptation to light. This shows you a panorama of the work, which is a community project. Anadromous Awakening traces out the return of anadromous fish to spawn in a cyclical celebration of life, death, and rebirth. And perhaps your children's children might actually live in a time when fish swim over former fields. Now, in summary, my Landscape Mosaics looks at the color and pattern of the Atlantic salt marsh landscape from satellite imagery to the ground plane, the study and palette of the plants within each ecosystem, and the conflicts of climate change, development, and fragmentation. Drawings and color studies developed into site installations for highlighting concerns for vanishing landscapes and endangered species. Requiem for Drowning Landscape traces the life and death of the Atlantic salt marsh from dormancy, growth, maturation, reproduction, senescence to death. The gallery space becomes a place for remembrance, recollection, and retelling through portraits, projections, and narration that describes the life and slow death of the coastal landscape to the rising seas. Anadromous Awakening traces out the return of the anadromous fish to spawn in a cyclical celebration of life, death, and rebirth. And with that, I'd like to give thanks to all of those, my acknowledgements, who have mentored and supported my efforts over the years. And I list references here for some of the statements on climate change. I want to thank the AIC for the invitation to speak within this forum, and to you for listening to my talk. We'll take questions now.
Yes, and please, if you have a question, you are welcome to raise your hand and unmute and ask Joseph a question directly. Well, I think it's stunning and overwhelming work, and it's so impressive and so rich, and we are only, I think, catching a small glimpse of the detail involved in this work. Does anybody have a question they'd like to pose? Give you a second to think. Oh, Anya, hello. Go ahead, please.
Hello, hi. That's just such a beautiful, beautiful talk and art and ideas. It's sort of a question, sort of a comment, but it looks to me like one could actually read season quite well from your color palettes. I mean, presumably you can, if someone presented you with a series of color palettes, you would probably be able to identify the month, if not the week, from the time when they were obtained, at least from the marshes. And I'm just quite interested in the notion that from color palettes, you can read other attributes, not just properties of surfaces, but things like season or time of day. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on a little more on that.
That is true. It was an exhaustive study. I actually was visiting the marsh each day, and I had fixed hours in the day when I visited. And I had mentioned that I originally had tried painting the colors, but that was inaccurate. It wasn't sufficient. So I was actually holding Pantone color chips up against the plants during specific times of day and lighting conditions in order to extract the color palettes. And so you could also say that it's a study of the climate, the weather, the climate, and the health of the species that are being studied. It was exhaustive, I have to admit, and the synthesis was, especially when I started going into the images, and I was actually working with Felisa Frankel at MIT at a class that I took on communicating science. And when I explained that I was going into the pixels, before you had simplified ways of extracting color from images, they were sort of amazed that I would do that, because it was so tedious to do it pixel by pixel and blend into pixel by pixel in order to extract a sort of a composite of the color palette for those species. And I should tell you a little story. One time after working on that exhaustively, it was like 2 a.m, and I padded my way upstairs to bed. And I lived on a farm at the time, and I have like a balcony with windows that overlooked an alley of apple trees and fields beyond. And it was a full moon, and it had begun to snow, and the snow had crystallized, and the room was filled with prismatic color. It was almost a blessing that I saw. I didn't document it because it was enough to absorb it. And so that night I fell asleep with all of these colors, actually prismatic colors within the room. It's a true story. It may seem unbelievable, but the angle of the moon, the full moon, and the ice crystals and the white walls of the bedroom were completely lit up and then transformed with color. So that was my thanks and my blessing, I think, for the work. But yeah, you can tell the seasons, depending on location, of course. You can tell within certainly the salt marsh of the coastal landscape, the seasons. So in short, yes.
Joseph, there is a question from Marcia Cohen about how long the poles were up in the project you showed with all the colored poles. How long were they there? What were they made of? And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you, I believe, did some kind of a educational panel where people could stop and read about what this project was.
That is true. This was part of the Cyber Arts Festival, and so the Cyber Arts Festival had a fixed time. And because this was in a somewhat sensitive landscape, I had to go through extensive permitting. For example, I had to go through the Army Corps of Engineers. I had to go through the local watersheds. I had to go through conservation commissions. I had to go through three towns that were abutting the river, and as well as with the police because of the parking for it. And the piece went up for a season. I wish it could have been up for the full season for each of the seasons, but unfortunately it wasn't allowable because of the sensitive location. But in the time that it was up, I was able to experience the full flooding of the marsh from the spring tides that would rise up over the Spartina patens marsh, for example. And but I wasn't able to take it through the autumn, the late summer seeding, nor the autumn. Perhaps another time. but I will say that when I was offered not a residency, but I was given full carte blanche to a sanctuary in Wellfleet with the Audubon Society, they allowed me to put in the panels, and they stayed for a period of time. So that's where I was doing what I called the pixel panels of the Pantone color mosaic that went in from an overlook, and those did stay for a period of time, and as well as the colored posts. The posts were 8 foot, made of white oak. I wish it could have been of white cedar, which have been the Atlantic white cedar, which would have been indigenous to the area, but that wasn't allowable. So I used white oak. They were double primed, and then they were painted using custom mixed acrylic paints. And I will say that Benjamin Moore actually worked with me on this. And then what I did is I took the Benjamin Moore colors, and then I worked them with the Pantone colors in order to get the color correct for that particular time in the salt marsh. And we had students painting them, and with myself included. And then the installation was long planks. We didn't want to do any damage to the marsh. So what we did is we extended long planks into the salt marsh and installed the works as deeply as we could without any damage. And they did withstand the flooding. There was no floating free. I tried to get them as straight as we could when we installed them. And so they stayed for a season for the Cyber Arts Festival. And then, unfortunately, I had to take them down from that site on the North River.
We have a comment here, Joseph, from Judith Tinkle saying, I think this should be very widely shared as such an important issue in the climate worry. Is there any way it could go to PBS, for example? You have exhibited these works in some significant institutions.
I have. They were shown in New York and at the Museum of Science there. And then also at, let's see, I was also interviewed by PBS Public Radio for some of the works. And others have been exhibited in various sanctuaries or different places. But it's true, I think it's a clarion call, and it's sort of important that the word gets out. And the trouble in the United States with communicating science is that oftentimes the science is written in such technically dense language that it's difficult for the public to understand. And so that's why I was